Hello, and welcome to Pragmatic Live, Pragmatic Marketing's webinar and podcast series where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product teams. My name is Rebecca Calageris. I am the Vice President of Marketing and Sales at Pragmatic Marketing, and more importantly to you, the host for today's event. Before we get started, a couple of housekeeping items. First, a recording of this webinar and a copy of the slides will be available afterwards. You'll be able to access them by the end of the day at pragmaticmarketing.com/live. Second, questions. We love questions and want this to be as interactive as possible. If you look to the left of your screen, you'll see a chat box. Whenever the desire arises, feel free to enter any and all questions you have in that box, and we'll work hard to get through as many of those as we can throughout the presentation. Now, many of you are already familiar with Pragmatic Marketing, but for those of you not aware of us until today, welcome. Pragmatic Marketing specializes in training companies and product teams on how to be truly market-driven. We provide techniques for listening to the market and gathering market facts, and then using those facts to shape strategies and drive execution. And we've been doing this and doing it quite successfully for over 20 years. Today's topic is one highly relevant to so many companies we work with. What is the role, if any, of the product roadmap in today's Agile development environments? Helping us address this topic are two longtime friends of Pragmatic Marketing, Mike Smart, former Pragmatic instructor and now founder and principal consultant at Egress Solutions, and Scott Sehlhorst, founder and principal consultant at Tyner Blain. You're in great hands with these two, so without further ado, here are Mike and Scott.
Thank you, Rebecca. This topic started sort of as a question, and it was a conversation that kind of put on a table. Are we living in an era where roadmaps are obsolete? So Scott and I teamed together, spent a lot of time kind of working over the question, thinking about it, even having some healthy discussion about it, and came up with a set of what we think are directives and just some backdrop that allow us to think, put this question on the table, and then move forward to think about how we want to use roadmaps going forward. So at the end of this session, what we're optimistic you'll get out of this, among other things, but certainly you'll understand the most effective use for roadmaps in the iterative environment that most of us operate in today. The other thing that we're confident you'll get out of this is the ability to communicate and develop some effective tools to communicate internally and externally to the audiences, and there are different communication requirements. We'd like, as Rebecca said, to keep this session straightforward. We'd like to keep this session moving. We want questions, so feel free to ask them at any time. We'll sort them out as we move through. In fact, we're going to start out with a question. The question I'd like to ask you to answer is, does your company have a formal road mapping process in place? Yes or no? We're getting good response here. And we're starting to taper off. If you haven't responded, please do.
It's pretty impressive how consistent the ratio stays as everybody votes. You know,
it looks like it.
The sampling.
Yeah, it's and this is good news.
There are a lot of comments wishing there was a sort of option.
I know. We actually tried to think about how to break this down. So I understand the question forces a binary answer. It's a tough question to answer yes or no. So I appreciate the comments about the sort of or maybe or it depends. That was one of the things I was going to put under yes, no, or it depends.
Right. It could be yes, but I don't like it, or yes.
Well, exactly, and that's where it gets into is a lot of permutation. So, yeah, we were stuck with this one, but we're getting good response here. We're almost topped off. Well, actually not. Well, I'll get a few more seconds. Like the popcorn kernels popping in the microwave. Down to the last few kernels. I've used that before. I know it's not funny now.
Yeah, it looks like about 90% response rate.
Yeah, I think so. We're going to close the poll. And so 66% of you say yes, which is good news, and 34% say no, which is kind of interesting. And I think the deeper question or the chat question about other options would be a good way to explore this. But for now, this is a good way to think about it. One of the things that we struggled with and we talked about and we've seen, and this comes from a lot of work that I've done with a wide range of companies, and the work that I do and the work that we do around helping best practices get engaged on product management and building better products, is that today we live in this world where a vast majority of companies have moved to some form of iterative approach. And because of that, sometimes roadmaps stop being used, as I've talked to product teams, product leaders, product executives, and CEO, roadmaps stop being used or become less valuable internally as a planning vehicle based on feedback because they're cumbersome. The traditional methods are out of phase with a more specific, rapid feature release, rapid release methodology. They have the potential of being out of sync or out of alignment with the actual planning cycle. And so people have started to deploy and use more of the backlog tools, the backlog methods to track the plan for the roadmap moving forward. And it's not that this was the intent of Scrum or Agile or Lean or any of those kinds of things. It is, though, an unintended consequence, and it's something that needs to be looked at. The other element of this that we think makes sense and we look at and think about is that many of the stakeholders that sit around the periphery of this area mistakenly believe that the deliverable, the actual deliverable, the document, represents a set of planning cadence, planning principles when they see it, and in many instances it does not. And that leaves potentially some room for some gaps in terms of alignment, in terms of vetting, in terms of the business dynamic of how the roadmap actually represents what's really going on. And then another one that we see that I would say is fairly widely distributed among certainly the customer base that I visit and talk to, is that product managers inside organizations will have relatively diverse processes, I call it ad hoc on the slide, for actually doing the roadmap. Some are more process specific and oriented, some are not. And so this leads for a large range of potential outcomes, some of them okay, and some of them not good. And when I talk about the okay outcomes, if you are using a shorter term window to do planning like a product backlog and engaged in a set of practices that represent the planning, that can be okay. But if you're supplementing the backlog for a long-term view of the product, that's not. We find that the need for roadmaps is a little bit different than what it was. So one of the things that we know is that this iterative process, I've said before, makes it cumbersome. The other thing that we find that there's not as much anxiety about from a customer standpoint because many of our solutions are now deployed in the cloud and they're SaaS-based. And so if we're frequently dropping features in, customers can elect to use them, they're putting less pressure on us in some instances. And the reality is we've turned up the frequency and cadence of the factory, so to speak. The process goes faster. And so because of that, and the fact that some of the risk is shifted as we look at SaaS-based and cloud-based deployments, more on the vendor than the customer, the outbound view and the outbound demand for this has basically, it's not as great as it used to be. Scott, do you have any other points or any additional things you want to add here?
Well, I think one of the interesting things any given company can have a different process for roadmap creation. And what starts to get scary is when different product managers within the same company with similar products are not using the same processes. And it sort of dilutes the organization's ability to be concerted and effective.
Absolutely. And as we roll then the plans up, these individual product plans up to product suite level or portfolio level, the risk associated with the soundness of the plans is really obvious at that point in time. Let's move on, and I want to share with you a case study. This is a pseudonym company. It's not the real company's name. This company is a software company that provides time and billing, accounting systems, and those kind of related capabilities for professionals such as lawyers and accountants. And a colleague of mine went to work there and found, as he stepped into the role to run the product management organization, that they were running a mixed environment. They had teams that were running Agile or Scrum and teams that were running Waterfall. And it was partly because they had rolled up different companies in the process. This was the company existed in part out of the existence of the merger of two or more companies. They had a fairly long history of not delivering what they committed to on a roadmap to the customer base. And there was a lot of friction between them and their customers about the viability and the credibility of the company when it came to product planning and product strategy. And they also believed that producing the deliverable was effectively the same thing as producing the process for the plan. Execs, unfortunately, had gotten impatient and stakeholders, and they basically hijacked the process. They stepped in and started guiding the direction roadmap. So my colleague jumped in and declared he wanted to fix this. And I'm not going to read the solution list to you, but some pretty obvious things here. And so what he determined was that we needed to bring some best practice in place. And the first thing he did in this process was to declare, because he was going to take it back from the exec team and provide some discipline, was to declare that this process was owned by the VP of Product Management himself and his team, and that it wasn't a product-specific process, it was a business-specific process, obviously driving and affecting and pushing on product initiatives and priorities. He also, in order to make this change happen, and it was fairly dramatic, agreed and accepted the premise that this was not a bottom-up technical process, it was a top-down business process. And for that reason, stakeholders were allowed to have a great deal of influence, we'll call it, beneficial influence in determining what's going on. They didn't own the process, they weren't accountable for the process, they weren't responsible for it, but they were certainly informed of it on a regular, consistent basis, and they were certainly consulted on an ongoing basis. And he defined then 3 specific deliverables, something he called portfolio plans, which then obviously subset of that would be specific roadmaps, and that he added to it in that to make this a credible process, we're going to add some level of financial analysis, business case analysis along with it to build the construct that says we are building credible product going forward. Another piece of this, which is not on this slide, is that he actually encouraged and convinced the CEO to go to the customer base and completely decommit the current roadmap, which was a little bit traumatic, but it turned out to be a huge boon for the company because the customers didn't believe in a roadmap anyway. And so by admitting that they were decommitting from what currently sits on a roadmap until such time that they could do the internal process work, the planning work, the revalidation work, the alignment work, all of those things that had to happen, the customers were actually favorably disposed to say, look, we will sit with you and wait for you to turn this around. It took them some time, and at a subsequent meeting after they did a lot of work, they went back and re-engaged the roadmap process publicly to the customer base and started to deliver on it. And then over a period of about a year, they gained a lot of credibility back. So this process declaration, and that meant there's a lot of work going in internally more so than is externally, was how he basically sees control of this. If you think about this, and you think about something like a RACIC diagram or a RACIC method in terms of somebody being responsible, accountable, somebody being supported, somebody being informed and consulted, what he basically said is product management is responsible, accountable for producing this planning process. And executives and stakeholders can be supporters, can be informed, and certainly will be consulted. And it is a process, not a document. What they learned was that prioritizing a list didn't justify the gate that was set or the bar that was set for being a roadmap. More importantly than that, it was, as you started to build out across multiple products, those prioritized lists could create conflict among stakeholders like, critical stakeholders like development. They also learned and accepted the fact, and I said this earlier, that stakeholders can drive this roadmap process at the level they're allowed to participate in. The objective is to get to marketable products and what they really want to drive toward. Product managers had to use the same processes, picking up on the concern that Scott talked about just a few minutes ago, that inside the organization, that one product manager to another are using exactly the same sequence, deliverables, process steps, and all of those things line up together. So there's a way to build some credible information, some credible risk mitigation in the process. And then the implementation had to be defined around roles and responsibilities, and it was going to be, at least for this company, necessarily a top-down oriented process. Bottom line, which is not on the slide, is, and you need both of these tools. You need this long-term view and this execution view of your product direction in order for this to work. They're not a mutually exclusive. They're an and sort of situation. Scott, anything you want to add from this, or let me just move to the question. So we've got a survey question, a poll question here. We're going to ask you to answer again. Are your roadmaps credible and reliable for answer option? Less than 12 months, more than a year, less than 2 years, more than 2 years?
Yeah, and if I can jump in while folks are answering the survey question, we had a couple of things coming up. One person asked who the SLT was, the Strategic Leadership Team.
Thank you. And yes, I skipped that. Yes, SLT is Senior Leadership Team. Thank you.
And there were a couple different questions around sort of teasing out the difference between the process and the deliverables. And I'll throw out one way that I think about it, and that's when you think about a decision that's been made, if all you document is the final decision and not the dialogue, then you end up actually losing a lot of information. That there's value that comes from the rationale used to drive decisions, and right. And so that's to me that's where you find value in the process being distinct from the deliverable of, well, we chose X.
And I think that's right. I have a couple of fun ways to think about this. I'm a hack cook in the kitchen, and I think about the process and the deliverable thinking about a dinner metaphor. If I'm fixing a dinner party for 12 or 15 people, I sell them on the menu. I tell them what's for dinner and when it will be served. And that's the presentation of what I use to get people to come to my house to enjoy themselves and have a good time. And then I have a shopping list. And that's not that interesting. And so this idea of basically thinking about the process is what happens in between. And in addition to that, I'm looking for ways to align with those people who are either going to help me or those people are going to be critical to me getting this process done in the same way that roadmaps and road mapping or process. And it is really about alignment. It's about prioritization. And in product management, we're the only organization in the company who can actually credibly assess priority, balancing those things that are required from existing customers, those things that represent opportunity in the marketplace, and those things that are actually technically necessary to go forward. And leaving that to anyone else upsets the balance of the product direction, the product strategy. So we have 972 answer. We're going to go to this, close the poll. 1 or 2, 3 more coming in. Done. And the answer is an overwhelming majority of you have a roadmap that is credible and reliable for less than 12 months. and very few of you have anything going out beyond 2 years.
The optimist in me, I hope that that's because you're in fast-moving markets versus rapid changes of direction. If we move on to sort of the big picture, and we think about, and when as product managers we're responsible for the product, but our decisions are all happening in a context. If we think about what the executives are focusing on, I mean, they're sort of starting with a simple question of how are we going to grow our business? Are we going to sell into our existing markets or move into new markets? And then sort of the next question is, well, are we going to do that with our existing products or with new products? And this is, sort of an MBA 101 way of framing the space, but a lot of your conversations happen in this context. And then you can drill down into a very similar view, which is to say, okay, in a current market, are we talking about selling more stuff to our current customers, or are we talking about selling our existing stuff to new customers in the same space? Are we doing share of wallet play, or are we trying to do a market share play? And at that high level, that's the kind of stuff that's setting the context for all of our road mapping decisions that we should be making. And anybody who's worked with a backlog can sort of say, well, backlogs don't talk about any of this at all. Which leads us to a next survey question. In your company, what function is responsible and accountable for the product planning process? And your choices, product management, development, sales, execs, or no one?
And again, while we wait for people to answer, we've got a bunch of questions coming in.
Yes, we do.
Or Mike, is there any correlation in your mind, or have you seen, between the profitability of the company and the credibility of the roadmap?
I personally haven't seen a direct correlation. However, one that can be proven by arithmetic or mathematics, but as I look at companies, those who manage this part of the process well seem to run the business overall better. Where I see companies, small and large, grappling well with this, and sometimes this is not an elegant process. It can be a gnarly process. It's just part of it is. But if they figure out how to wrestle it to the ground, their products seem to have greater acceptance in the marketplace. They have absolutely high credibility with the customer base in their market, in their intended market. And their products seem to have better margin on sell and on success analysis than companies who are struggling. And it's not intuitive, but it's certainly logical to see the extent of that. If we're struggling to build the right things, the likelihood of getting high margin when we put things out are probably going to suffer. Scott, you may have a take that's different or amplified.
Well, no, yeah, I think they're orthogonal concepts. One does not drive the other. Having a good product and a good engagement with your market doesn't assure that you actually had a good business case. But I think people who are intentional and methodical and making good decisions around one perspective on how they run their business are more likely to make good decisions along the other. And so, to Mike's point, I don't think there's any sort of I think it's more likely than not. If I had to guess, I'd say the people who are making good strategy decisions are more likely to be profitable than the ones who don't.
Right. So just to fairness, we've got a number of questions here. I'm just going to roll through. Rebecca, if you don't mind, I'm just seeing some come up that says, one of them here is asking about road mapping tools. Can we save that to the end, sir, if you will? We can talk a little bit about that. The next one has to do, what do you mean by supplementing the backlog is not good? I think what we were intending to communicate was that having only a backlog, which is an execution-oriented part of this planning process, is not enough. And we'll get into that more when we get into a slide downstream. It's about 2 slides off. The next one here says, can you make, well, where was it? software company, should we aim to have roadmaps that are longer than a year? And I would say, yes, aim to do it. Getting out past 2 years is difficult, but certainly when you look at a planning horizon, seeing what's coming beyond a year is it's pretty basic, fundamental idea of doing strategic planning and long-range planning. Any other questions you see, Rebecca, that we haven't picked up on that we should at this point?
I think at this point we can go forward and grab some of the other ones at the next.
All right. So there's the response. Overwhelming people, that's good. 77% to this role, this process belongs to product management.
Yeah, so I'm real happy with that. Getting as many responses as we did of development driving direction does sort of put in perspective that this is a potentially very real problem, and certainly one that we've seen of trying to drive things from the backlog. So right before the poll, I talked about an executive focus, starting out at this really pretty high-level, abstract, strategic level of conversation about what you're choosing to do. And if we think about that executive focus, that we're taking a particular approach with our portfolio and our products based on a business case that's a function of doing market development, for example. And then there's this sort of mysterious magical process that happens, and the output of that is our thematic product roadmap. And I think it's particularly important to talk in terms of your roadmap, in terms of saying these are the target customers for whom we're solving a set of problems, or even better, a set of target customers who are trying to solve a set of problems that we intend to help them solve. Keeping that outside-in, market-driven perspective, and with relatively coarse-grained timing, because we don't want to limit our ability to change decisions as we get smarter. And over the next couple slides, I'll talk about what I mean by that. So the magic happens here piece, in 1 hour, in a 1 hour session talking about road mapping in an Agile or iterative context, we can't really get into how do you make the right decisions that feed into your roadmap. Mike alluded to it as being a consistent process, and I made the comment of any given company is going to have a different process. But I think you can sort of summarize what the output of that process is: identifying which customers you want to serve, which problems they have you want to help solve, and to what degree you want to help solve the problems, which is another dimension that we hadn't talked about so far. There's the concept of satisficing. There's notions of diminishing returns that come into play. But at the end of the day, all of those decisions are effectively manifesting your company's strategy in a thematic roadmap. Now, if we switch gears for a second, if we think about what Mike and I have been talking about so far is just sort of left to right or top-down view of why you're doing what you're doing as a company. If we think about Agile, Agile grew out of the development community, the engineering teams, and they had a focus that starts more in the immediate present. And Agile is actually sort of an overloaded term that has, I think, three really powerful aspects of meaning. The first of which is improving the craft of developing software, using software as my sort of framing market, but it has parallels in other spaces. Improving your craftsmanship is part of Agile. And another aspect of Agile that's, I guess, more organizationally visible is improving the efficiency of your process, right? Moving to an iterative cadence and getting your team able to create whatever they create faster and better. So the combination of those two things is what development teams focus on. And when we think about the great big picture problem of your company trying to be profitable, help your customers solve their problems, create products, they're essentially narrowing their scope, and they're defining their scope and their area of focus. And I like the Agile lifecycle management view, the sort of peeling the onion kind of view, is is perfectly appropriate, and it's exactly the right view for the people on the engineering side of the house to have. If you initially focus on what you're doing at any given moment in the context of what you do every day, within every iteration, within every release, and all of that stuff is happening in the context of a strategy. Now, unfortunately for us, we sort of get a little bit of a burden, us being product folks, in that as Agile gains ground, most of the people who are doing Agile, preaching Agile, teaching Agile, coaching Agile, are focused on the development teams. And so they sort of say, given a strategy, here's how we would manage our releases, iterations, daily activities, and continuously what we do to get better. And again, that is exactly the right scope and focus for them. The problem is it's so powerful and so effective for them that some companies end up misapplying it and thinking of this as the framework for making decisions about collectively what we're doing as a business. Now, I mentioned that there's three important aspects of Agile, and I listed two of them. The third one is about business agility. It's about, as a company, being able to change directions as we get smarter. As product managers, we know that we are out learning about our markets, learning about our customers, and about the problems that we're helping them solve. We're continuously getting smarter. We're, if you want to think about it in terms of lean software and Steve Blank and customer development, we're outside of the building getting better insights into what we should be doing, not necessarily how we are going to do it. And Agile development as a process gives us the opportunity to minimize the cost of changing what we're asking the development team to do, given a particular cadence or time frame. And to oversimplify a little bit, in the very immediate term, you use the feedback from customers and the market research that you gain that makes us smarter to revisit the choices we made about how we're designing our solution, to revisit our implementation and make it better. And it's essentially saying, given a set of problems for a set of customers, let's iterate on our solution. And so then in a slightly larger time frame, still near term though, we are afforded the opportunity to revisit the selection of which problems we're trying to solve and which customers we're trying to solve them for. It also gives us an opportunity to rethink our approach to satisfaction or satisficing and figuring out to what degree we want to solve any particular problem. Right? All of those choices were made based on a hypothesis that's supporting this higher level strategy. And as we get feedback and as we iterate, we get smarter and we have the opportunity to adapt our plans based on the information we get informing those hypotheses. All the way up to the broader time horizon of being able to say, we should completely rethink which markets we're playing in or which customers we're focused on, or our positioning in the market. Do we want to be high value, high price, or low value, low price, and assess competitive positioning and make those sort of bigger moves, right? And that's the real power and value, in my opinion, that comes from having Agile development. I mean, getting higher quality products at a lower cost in a faster time frame is great, but if you're not getting the right products, it's not nearly as great as it could be. And so when you think about road mapping, it's about being afforded the opportunity to change directions and change our roadmap without incurring a penalty from our development team, because they're using a process that's designed to be adaptive to change and encourage change. And that sort of brings us back to the challenge of sort of misthinking about what a backlog is. A backlog is just a container of requirements, and I sort of alluded to this earlier when I talked about capturing the rationale and not just the final results of the road mapping process. And it's that having a set of things that you want to do and an order in which you believe you want to do them, that's a snapshot that is reflective of a current level of knowledge. And as you get smarter, the set of things you want to do should be changing, and the order in which you believe they're important should be changing. And the backlog doesn't capture any of that information. It's just the container. It's the thing that the development team is pulling from and working against, but what's opaque to them, remember they waved their hand to the strategy piece, is the rationale that's driving a continuous update of that backlog. If you're a product owner, you think about grooming the backlog. Well, this is all the stuff that goes into the grooming. The visible part is changing the order, pulling stuff in, pulling stuff out, adding stuff in. But the important stuff isn't that. The important stuff is adapting your rationale and validating or disputing the hypotheses that lead to the decisions about what should be at the top of the list. And that takes me into our next poll question and an opportunity to address some of the many questions in chat.
Okay, we've got a lot of them here. A lot of questions about tools. I think we want to let's hold off on that until the end so that we can just encapsulate that.
And there was
someone asked
one question.
Go ahead.
No, I was going to say there's one question about what Scott just covered, and that was kind of an idea of what time frames you had in mind as best practice for current, near term, and future.
Unfortunately, you're going to get the consultant answer of it depends. It's a function of how rapidly your customers' expectations are changing, how quickly your competitors are moving as they introduce new products and capabilities and features and positioning in the market, and the capability of your team in terms of the cadence in which they can operate and make material changes. It could be for ridiculously high-performance teams, there's the notion of continuous deployment and literally pushing every change. You could have 2 changes pushed within minutes of each other, or hourly updates or daily updates. In my experience in enterprise space, excluding software as a service hosted type solutions, weekly is about as fast as you can do things materially and non-trivially in a coordinated way within an organization. 2 weeks to 1 month feels like a good cadence, again, depending on the nature of your industry.
Excellent. We can probably do one more question while people are responding. I don't know, Mike, if you had one in mind, or we have.
I actually have one here there are a couple here, but I'll focus on the one. One asked a question earlier about selling. How do you balance selling to new customers, selling to existing customers, and keeping the product technically, I'm going to use my term, technically relevant, or keeping up with standards and evolution? And there are a number of questions about that. And I'll say you're about one slide away from how we would suggest you talk about these things and capture them. But the answer is the roadmap needs to reflect all of these things, and that's what makes this such a complicated process, because you've got to build all of these assumptions and all of these sets of things into the process.
Yeah, and I realize I want to reiterate something that I don't know that I said it strongly enough, and that's the point that, to me, the most effective use of a roadmap in an iterative environment is updating the roadmap based on what you learn as you get each prototype, each new feature, each release of the product in the hands of customers and users, and as you learn new things in the sort of the parallel track of understanding the market and doing win-loss analysis and all of the stuff that we already do.
And in fact, I think the fact that the iterative environment, which sort of starts this conversation, at least for us, a little bit, sort of begs the question or forces the question to be aligned with iterative principles, is that we don't know everything, and we have to be willing as we learn new things to change and pivot. And the roadmap should be viewed as a tool that we keep everybody in sync on how we pivot, not weekly, but certainly from one medium to long range cycle to another. Last year we were going to build X. Market has proven that's not viable. We don't want to build it if it's not viable. And so, as Scott alluded to, we're picking up all of these market inputs. The roadmap should reflect these things as we learn, and we should be then guiding directional changes based on those things, and it should be represented in the roadmap as well.
Right, and we're not talking about features. We're talking about problem areas and target
companies. Yes, good, thank you. Yes, so I think we've topped out on the response. I'm going to close it. Let's see what we've got here. Most of the people are using both. That's good. That's encouraging. Very few people are relying on a backlog alone.
But yes, so there's about 100 people that I think their teams could definitely benefit from incorporating roadmap into how they communicate internally. Right.
And there have been some questions about communication. So that's a segue to the next slide. There's two parts of this. And we set up the first part of this to sort of describe the process. And while we could spend an entire day talking about this, we tried to condense that part of the conversation into about 25 minutes. So we certainly know that we're not giving it the level of detail that it's warranted, but we tried to just put some key concepts out here. That's one issue. That's one element of it. The other element of it is communicating it. And we come from a premise and belief that we start out by communicating value, that the roadmap is the mechanism by which we tell both internal people, internal stakeholders, internal organization, and the external market why we're doing what we're doing and what it really means. And so we borrow from something that comes out of a quality initiative, first put into play at a Toyota Motor Company, a gentleman named Kano who came up with this notion of, and I'll just quickly just kind of briefly go through this so that everyone sort of follows along. This principle, let me get my pointer working here. There we go. This principle says that in the marketplace, when we deal with customers, we have a continuum of things going on. We have customers that are dissatisfied all up to continuum satisfied. And that we also have features or capabilities in our product that go from not implemented at all to fully implemented. And along this continuum, we want to strive to do several things. And we believe, and I believe, this is relevant to building especially technology and software products. We want to provide the communication and provide priority for building things that we call basic needs. So the questions that come up earlier about keeping products up to standards, keeping products in compliance, keeping products in relevance to regulatory requirements, those are things that we would call basic needs. It's no different than fixing Sev 1 or Sev 2 bugs in a product. And in order to communicate what's going to happen there, those products need to be updated. And if you collectively build a set of capabilities or features into your plan that are representative of basic needs, it's a healthy way to communicate what you're doing. The second element of this is to build things that are basically addressing performance needs. Assume that more is better. We want less clicks to get to a report. We want one login mechanism that basically drives us to get to all of the apps or all the related applications that we need. We want one security tool that allows us to protect our environment, our laptop or our device of choice. We want more users supported on this, and all those things are driven by performance. And for the existing customer base, the first two things, basic needs and performance tools, are actually critically how they value their continued use of the product. The next thing we want to talk about is then this notion of delighters or excitement. These are things that come in anticipation of a use or problem. Sometimes they come to us from outside, sometimes they come to us from inside, but these are things that the customer basically sees and uses, and in many respects create an awe factor or a wow factor. And when we think about building product over the long haul, if we collectively build things across the spectrum, some balance, and that balance will change depending on where your product is in its life cycle and where your market is in terms of absorbing and accepting and adopting the product. If it's a relatively new product, you're probably going to build more delighters or more excitement, or attempt to. If it's a more mature product, this is probably where you're going to be on balance. But the point is to build out this capability so that we're talking about these three elements of the product, both internally and externally. And when we do it this way, what we find is that it's a great way. I was talking about this to one of the marketing people around here, and I said, it's similar to staying on point, and politicians talk about staying on point. If we think about the roadmap as a communication tool, we want to stay on point. And so if we stay on point using a metaphor like this or a methodology like this, and there are others, we're going to always be able to talk about the value of what we're doing. Scott, any other thoughts or additions you want to add to this?
No, I think you've got it solid, and I'm looking at this huge backlog of fantastic questions. So let's move through. I think we're getting up to the top of the hour, so let's capture some of these questions. Because I think this will go quickly, and it answers a couple of questions here, unless there's other comments or other things we need to pay attention to here. There was one thing about, you mentioned the point about balancing sort of your investment, your portfolio of investments in your product across addressing different types of problems.
Yes.
And there were a couple questions about how do you balance product investment versus internal investment. So there's broken windows, internal process improvement, that sort of thing.
To me, I capture them in this way. Those are things I would call either basic needs. For instance, I have an aging platform, and it's starting to create technical debt that's really starting to expand, and it's going to ultimately affect our ability to deliver in the future. That, at a minimum, could be considered something that classifies basic needs or performance needs. Those things need to be built into our planning and built into the horizon. And as we chunk them up, because we're not generally going to be allowed to fix those kinds of things all at once, we're communicating to development that we want them to give us those kinds of things because they play into reducing the technical debt and having a product remain viable.
Yeah, completely agree. And the only thing I would add to that is thinking back to that strategic context. If you formulated a particular strategy that will only succeed, that the success or failure of that strategy is dependent on your organizational capability to deliver, then that's going to either justify investing in improving your process or devalue those investments appropriately for a given strategy.
Yes, yes. So let's talk about, there were several questions about how to communicate internally. Some of this comes from having seen some companies do this under a very strong structure, and I say that you take some of this and put it into the context that works best for your organization. But some of the best practice I've seen in this is around communicating internally around three major areas. The first one has to do with the notion of business case. And in this context, we're talking about product management collecting the market inputs, whether it be competitive inputs or it be customer-specific inputs related to attrition or retention, white space, which is existing opportunity, going back to that 2-by grid that Scott talked about a while ago, in terms of penetrating, getting deep in the market, or looking at things that may represent new segment opportunities. But those should be the non-feature, opportunistic market things that we want to use to drive the roadmap. They should be, they don't show up on the document, but they should be part of the critical thinking and the collective input of the process. The next piece to think about as we go through this process is aligning around specifically engineering resources and getting very deliberate and very specific around which teams or which resources are available to deal with which features or which areas of the product. And in addition to that, the go-to-market element, which is critical. So we can build something, we have great resource alignment, and then when it's time to launch it or put it in the marketplace, there is no sense of urgency. There's no commitment from the other parts of the organization cross-functionally to take the time, energy, and resources to move the product into a mode of being successful or to make it a sales-ready or sales-enabled product. I play with the notion that we will spend as much time and resources over here launching and taking a product to market as we do over here. They need to be given equal treatment. And then when we communicate internally, and I know this is fine print, so I'll walk you through this, we should be using those elements that are driving us at the problem level and in the short term, sometimes even the feature level, as to why we are doing what we're doing. Many of us live in a world where customers still influence the roadmap, either because of dollars they wave in front of us or because of just influence. And so if those elements are getting into our planning process, especially in the near term, we need to identify them. And so that people can see that while there's a certain set of resources and capability we have, we're spending some percentage of that on things that are being driven by potentially a market of one or a heavyweight customer. And in some businesses, this is perfectly acceptable. Competitive forces. If we are living in a high competitive response, a need to respond to competitive forces and respond quickly, those should be delineated and talked about. Internal forces, that's a euphemism for stakeholders, usually executives that get really deeply involved in what features they want to see and when. Other things that relate to this, and then the things that we knew that we were planning along themes. Down here, technology, this is technical debt. So as we communicate around our roadmap, we want to talk about it in these terms. Details in the near term, intentions, directions, problems in the long term. Communicating to the outside, take the same principles, but again, it's staying on point. This, for many of you, is the closing of a sales pitch. Sometimes it ends up getting put in that context. And so I would say less is better. Less specificity around this is better. And someone asked a question earlier about what about under NDA. So I would say the less you document, the better off you are. Assumption that I have about roadmaps that go out to the marketplace, assume whatever you put on a document, whether it be PowerPoint or whatever the medium is, it's going to end up in the hands of your competitors. And so I'd say operate with some sensitivity or mindfulness of that, and don't put anything documented down that you don't mind your competitor seeing, because it's either opaque enough or obscure enough that it doesn't give them anything to work with. As we communicate the roadmap, we want to do this in a sequence that follows something like this. I want to continue to reiterate long-term themes and timelines. That's the big picture. I want to move forward. I want to continue to reinforce the notion that we are making progress in the roadmap, that these things we have done recently, reinforcing the fact that our themes and timelines are credible and relevant, and then talk specifically about things that are current. If we're talking about something that's in our current quarter, forget the dates here, but this is Q2 coming up, we should be able to go into a fair amount of detail about these things and be willing for certain class of customers to share a good deal of detail about what's happening currently. We should be willing to go into a level of detail that's appropriate for things that are maybe 6 months out. And as we move further out, we become less specific about it. Always reinforcing this notion that we are building into the product, addressing basic needs, performance, and delighters, and point them out to communicate them that way. And then I would say then integrating this into a go-to-market calendar or marketing calendar is a way to make sure and communicate to the outside world that there is momentum and there is alignment around our product direction. We look at this and we put it into context. This is one activity that's in an entire process, and we just point out the things that we use to provide deliverables to suggest that as you go through this, putting these deliverables in place help us stay on track. The idea being that these areas, specifically the front end of this funnel, if you will, belong to product management, and obviously there are others downstream that take over some of these other things and drive them. Just to summarize, the idea is that remembering, this is a stakeholder-driven process. If you're in a relatively small company, under 500 employees, your CEO, your CFO, the people that basically are responsible for running the company are going to have a great deal of interest in this, and you might as well accept that and figure out how to work with them. If you're in a large company, it may not be that level of the organization, but clearly there are people around that are going to influence this. And so the best way to drive this process is to give them an avenue to have correct input. I mentioned using a RACIC diagram or a RACI chart to define who's accountable, who's responsible, who gets supported, who gets input, and who gets consulted. And if you can lay it out in that context and commit to them set of deliverables, you'll be better off. In the iterative environment, we're suggesting that you combine this process with a deliverable. And the most important things that we believe belong in this process, the process side of this, is looking at market and business case, allocating or looking at resource allocation, and coming up with prioritization. And in reality, and Scott brought this out very, very crisply, Reality is we learn from the things, and as an ongoing process, we learn from resource allocation, prioritization changes, and from business and market case input, and we're prepared to pivot, not every week, not for a feature, but pivot longer-term things as we go forward. And if we standardize around a key process for the entire product team, and try and live with inside some lean cadence. This should not be a heavy lifting exercise. It should be something that happens naturally, part of how we do that. Scott articulated how a process can work in that context. And then figure out the right containers you want to use. The process can go forward. And we've seen it work effectively with companies doing it, small and large. If you want additional information on this, we offer our contacts, our blog sites as a way to do this. We blog regularly. Scott has Tyner Blain. It's been an industry standard for 12 years. We've been doing a blog called Product Management 2.0 for a couple of years, and certainly reach out to us and provide any questions, and we'll be happy to respond. If you're looking for things, tools, and that sort of things, we have put up recently a library, call it that, which allows you to get additional resources, and there are a collection of things around product management best practice we're building out. It's a few weeks old, and we're continuing to add to it and build it out, so feel free to go out there and pull down something that may be relevant or meaningful to you. We're prepared to answer any questions in the time we've got remaining. Scott, you had a couple that you felt we needed to get kind of addressed or talk to.
No, I was good. I was just starting to get a little scared about time.
I was too. That's why I kind of was fast forwarding here. Rebecca, do you see any questions that are showing up that we haven't addressed?
There are a lot of questions.
Okay.
And we're not going to be able to get through all of them, certainly. I know a lot of people had asked about tools, and you did touch about that. And
I will amplify on the tool. I'm not going to endorse any particular software out there, but there are, starting about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I think we started seeing some really strong second, third generation tools show up in the marketplace. And without naming products, because I won't name them all, I can't remember them all, so that I don't offend or give short shrift to somebody who I didn't, and I know some of these people, I would say if you look for tools out in the marketplace and you're familiar with companies that develop product management specific tools or PDLC specific tools, many of those companies have adapted roadmap tools that allow this process to happen a lot easier than it has in the past. I know that's kind of a consulting answer, but I'm sorry. I can't get more specific than that here.
And we do have a lot more questions. And so what I think one of the things I want to encourage people is, I'm going to go back couple slides and make sure that they feel free to reach out to us or either of you if they have follow-up questions. We will be sending the link out with the deck and a copy of the recording as well. So we want to be respectful of everybody's time, but we are certainly available for follow-up questions. All right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us, and thank you Mike and Scott. It was a fabulous presentation. Remember, our webinars tie directly to our Box of the Month initiative, where we highlight a different topic from the framework each month and provide extra information, insights, and implementations guidance in that area. Next month's Box, as you can see, is lead generation, and we've lined up HubSpot to provide some hot tips and tricks that you can implement right after the webinar to boost up your lead generation. So be sure to join us. That's Wednesday, April 15th, and a link for registration will also be in the email that will go out tomorrow. So that does it for this edition of Pragmatic Live. Thank you for joining us, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Do we have the all clear? Hello? Hello?
we all
Hello,
clear?
Scott here.
Okay, and presenters, we're in post-conference.
Great. Well
Yay.
done.
So we clear now?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, we are. One moment. Let me get Rebecca and place her in with us. Okay, Rebecca? Okay, can you presenters hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
I can, Lori.
Okay,